Hello, I hope you can all hear me. This is Lizzie Chambers from Together for Short Life. We're going to start our webinar session this afternoon now. And we're really delighted to be joined by Maddie Blackburn from the Open University. We'll be handing over to Maddie shortly. So this is the programme for today. We may not be joined by Claire, but we have got the presentation from Maddie with a Q&A session afterwards. And again, just to say a big thank you to the James Tudor Foundation for funding this webinar series. So we're going to now hand over presenting rights to Maddie, who hopefully is on standby and waiting.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. And thank you for joining us this afternoon on this session about the sexuality of people, not just with life-threatening conditions, but life-limiting conditions. And what we're planning to do, and we hope that Claire will be able to join us, but if not, we did our Blue Peter Act before the session and prepared to have the information to hand around the law. This session is actually going to be divided into 4 parts. I'm actually going to begin the first session by setting out what sexuality means, particularly in the context of you as care practitioners and professionals, and actually what it really means for you in your role and your managers and your organisations. We'll touch a bit on sexual policies, and we will be exploring a couple of case histories. If Claire joins us, she will lead us on the law related to sexuality, and obviously we have both tried to focus on the practicalities, but also encompassing issues around emotional well-being, which are hugely important to this population. If Claire doesn't arrive in the next quarter of an hour, then I'll pick up on some of the key issues around the law that I think are relevant to you in practice. I too am a lawyer by background, but I'm no longer practicing because I do other things. The third bit, as I said, will be touching on a couple of case histories. Guy and Lizzie have kindly sent out the guidance and standards that were published by Together for Short Lives and the Open University in 2016. We can either draw on a couple of those, which I think would be helpful, because you should all have that information to hand, or we'll draw on a couple that Claire and I discussed before this session. And finally, not showing off my grandchildren, but there they are if you're tired at lunchtime, I hope when you are unmuted, we will have time for discussion and your questions, which I'll do my best to answer. So let's go to the first section. So what is sexuality? Why is it important for you as care practitioners? And how does this apply to you working with people with life-limiting conditions and life-threatening conditions in your everyday work? And what are the support mechanisms that you need? I think an appropriate place really to start off by asking the question, what is sexuality, is actually having a definition, and I don't expect you to absorb everything from this slide now, but you will be shared a copy of these slides after the presentation. But sexuality, I think one of the clearest and the most comprehensive of definitions is that supplied by the WHO, and they have are reviewing it again as we speak. But it embraces all sorts of features such as intimacy, pleasure, reproduction, desires, cultural values, practices. And whilst it may not encompass all of the things set out in the definition, some, or maybe all, do apply to people with life-limiting conditions. But fundamentally, and actually the backdrop of today's session, it is influenced by the interaction of emotional, biological, social, political, cultural, very importantly, governance and legal arrangements in the workplace, and of course one's own personal religious beliefs. So, why is sexuality important? For us all. It's meant to be fun, it's meant to be enjoyable, but particularly for this population, we do need to make sure we are considering some specific needs. Sexuality is a major component for all of us in terms of our spiritual growth and physical identity, and it will inform our personality and shape our emotional as well as our physical and spiritual development. You will all be aware that people with life-limiting conditions are living much longer now than ever before. And you will recall probably some of the work by Professor Bryony Beresford in York and Lorna Fraser and others who have highlighted this growth in population. And in recognising that people with life-limiting conditions are living longer, of course you have to embrace the fact that other issues will emerge, not least the sexuality. And that's probably something when young people actually used to die before their teens, as parents, as care professionals and practitioners, maybe we didn't need to consider in the same way, but we can no longer ignore. But of course, I recognise, and actually we all recognise, and the WHO recognise, that actually your role in supporting a young person address their sexuality in the workplace may actually have implications for your own cultural values and attitudes and beliefs. So what about young people and sexuality? Just a few principles for us to work on. Just as you and I, people with life-limiting conditions have the right to receive information about their physical, emotional and sexual development, about their self-esteem, their body image, and of course, how they may engage in relationships when given the opportunity at home, in the workplace, or whatever. For people with life-limiting conditions, this may present some practical difficulties for the young person, and first and foremost, in those early years and early teens, their parents or their key supporters. Sometimes parents and carers find it a difficult topic to address. And again, as I said in an earlier slide, that it may be distressing to parents to have brought up a child who they never thought was going to survive into adulthood, but has a severe physical disability or an impairment, that they may want to have a partner, or may be surprised they want to have a partner, and actually for the parents may not be a grandparent, and that can be very distressing. I think for practitioners and for all of us, it's really important, pivotal to remember that sexuality is not just about having sort of physical sexual intercourse and sexual partners. Relationships and other forms are really important, and recent research has highlighted that touch and smell and actually spending time either with the same, the opposite sex, or both sexes are equally important. And friendships are some of the most important things that all of us want to experience as we grow up. Your friends are the people you talk to. They're the people who understand the language that you speak, and they understand and recognise your uniqueness and what a good person you are. So moving on, what support do we require? What support do parents require? And what support do you as care practitioners require in order to be able to assist in discussions, in advice, in some of the practicalities about sexual feelings and engagement with people from the same or opposite sex? But most of all, what is pivotal in the workplace is understanding that acceptable and appropriate behaviour, and of course the dignity and respect for others particularly in a hospice or a hospital setting, residential care, wherever. Moving on, one of the things that is really fundamental is avoiding discussions around sex and sexuality. Really shouldn't be an option in the 21st century. Avoiding discussions about sex may lead to significant emotional distress in the individual, particularly in the young person, and that distress may be compounded and transferred to parents and those supporting them, like you. So, sex and sexuality should be addressed and highlighted within the holistic arena of health, social well-being. This is the nature of our work, but sexual health is fundamentally important within that arena of work. And young people, just like all of us, should have that opportunity to enjoy and control sexual and reproductive behaviour without shame, without guilt, without fear of reprisal, and actually, shameful beliefs. But it's not easy just to say those words. Young people will need support. They'll need support from their friends, of course, as we've said, from parents and carers, but very often they will need support from people like you, the very important care practitioners in their lives. But we recognise parents and carers and you as practitioners can't do this in isolation. So we'll need access to the right resources, training, information, just as much as the young person needs that information to equip themselves, but you will need that too to help support young people talk about sexuality. And if they have access to that information, and it may not just be in their early teens and late teens, it might be lifelong. Some of those discoveries may come later. And for those of you who work in transition units or young adult hospices will recognise that some of the questions appear in their late 20s or even beyond about their sexuality. So whose responsibilities in terms of providing information about sexuality, where does it actually lay in the workplace? Of course, care managers and the organisations themselves must have robust policies and must have clear practice boundaries in terms of the services that they provide within a hospice, residential, or even a hospice setting, particularly in relation to how they address intimacy and relationships at work, and very importantly, recognising that people with life-limiting conditions, some of whom may be vulnerable, so there may actually be potentially safeguarding issues that can't be ignored. But that doesn't mean to say sexuality should be ignored. Care staff, like yourselves, should be supported, provided the skills, training as we've already mentioned, and the support to actually help the individuals where they need help to access appropriate services. Professionals, care practitioners should also be able to support young people make choices and help them to understand what their wishes are in their best interests, and of course in the requirements of legislation. And I'll touch on one piece of legislation now, the Mental Capacity Act, and some of you, I'm very aware, will be supporting people in your work environments who actually have either minor, moderate or severe learning disabilities where that piece of legislation arises. But of course, balancing that protection of arguably a more vulnerable population, there is the right to choices. There are the rights to fun. And actually in the UK at this moment in time, we have an important piece of legislation, the Human Rights Act 1998, 8, which sets out in various articles issues that indirectly, if not directly, address the sexuality of young people and young adults. So the right to enjoy family life, the right to freedoms of expression, all of those arguably embrace important issues around choices related to sexuality. And of course, the legislation underpins both the welfare of the young person and not least yourselves, parents, care practitioners, those providing care and support. But I recognise as a former care practitioner that within work settings there are other considerations, and also many of you may actually be nurses or doctors or other health professionals or social care professionals, and you have to adhere to your own code of responsibility, whether that's the Nursing Midwifery Council, General Midwifery Council, BASWA, whatever. And you will have rules that you have to work within. You will have rules and guidance within your workplace that you have to work within. And as I said earlier, some care staff do feel uncomfortable in supporting young people talk about, let alone address some of the practicalities of sex and sexuality. And actually that is something that's really important that the individual, or indeed all the individuals, address in their own best interest, but particularly the young persons, and actually seek assistance from others if they find it particularly difficult to talk about sex or manage aspects of personal care or specific requests from a young person. Perhaps, you know, an older young adult, 21, 22 years, asking to see a sex worker. Maybe we come back to that later. Care staff who feel strongly about this, as stated, must really talk to their colleagues, their managers, and the person that is receiving care, that they are uncomfortable addressing the topic, and will find someone who is better able, perhaps has received that training and the support, and feels very comfortable discussing the issues of sexuality that adhere to the responsibility for that individual person's care. So I touched on clinical governance. I mentioned in an earlier slide that you have to adhere to your own professional body's governance arrangements as well as your organisations. But the Royal College of Nursing and the Care Quality Commission themselves have actually set out some key considerations which I am sure apply to your everyday work and actually the policies and practices within your own organisation. So in terms of information, it's really important how sexuality information is not only discussed, but its presentation. It may be, particularly as a young adult over 16 years of age, it's actually better that they have access online to reputable sites, and increasingly around the country, and some work that's where the Open University are engaged in, are looking at professional online education resources in relation to sexuality. Quality improvements. Now, you will be aware, because you received from Guy and Lizzie, the talking about sexuality, relationships, guidance and standards. And actually what we have tried to do through our joint work is set out some key standards that are important for individuals, people like yourselves, the care practitioners supporting young people, managers and organisations. And actually what we designed these for was that in your own workplace, that those supporting you at management level would produce an internal policy with the support of these, and you would review those. And when in doubt or feeling nervous about issues of sex, you know where to look yourself to find information. But it is important that care practitioners like you are supported yourselves. and know how to address sex, intimacy and relationship. And good leadership will help diminish those long-standing taboos that we've read in various articles and about various organisations, and at the end of the day will hopefully boost confidence in staff and improve knowledge. Can I just pause there, hear a sound? Has Claire joined us before I move on?
Hi Maddie, it's Lucy here. No, Claire's been trying to join but hasn't got web connection.
Okay. I heard a sound change. Forgive me, audience. I will.
That's okay. We'll hand back. Okay.
So I'll carry on. So those responsibilities are threefold. You know, important. Primarily, the young person has access to information that the practitioners like yourselves, and particularly parents who are actually providing care and support probably for much longer than they ever envisage, that everyone can access good information and actually are clear about the responsibilities and what you can do and you can't do in the workplace. And there are some good examples I'm sure of you're aware of around the country. I might just mention one. Rainbow's Hospice did some pioneering work. They have designed their own sexual policy, pulling out of the standards and guidance that Together Short Lives and the Open University produced. And they've also created what we call sexuality champions. So have trained up sort of care practitioners who have that responsibility for not only supporting other members of staff in the workplace, but to make sure that there is appropriate information ready available to support the young person, but indeed the care practitioner. And there are other examples evolving around the country as well. Just a couple of other points that I think are really important. We touched if care staff do feel uncomfortable, and that might be for religious or personal reasons in supporting young people around sex. You cannot insist on that individual being forced to address the topic of sexuality. But as I said earlier, it really is important that you access somebody rather ignoring the requests and the concerns of a young person, and try and get a colleague who does feel confident in addressing a topic around sexuality, such as masturbation or wanting to see a sex worker, or actually bringing a girlfriend or a boyfriend into the hospice. You know, what are the boundaries? What are the rules? But don't ignore it. That is a really, really important suggestion I would make to you today. And if you go away with nothing else, is to take away the importance that when in doubt, don't be afraid to ask. And ideally, that should be one of your managers or someone else more senior in the organisation, or maybe a member of staff who really is, you know, very comfortable with this discussion topic. We touched indirectly several times on training, and just a little bit more. I mean, it's important that you parents access training, but it's managers and organisations need to lead by example, and to ensure that sexuality is not a taboo subject. It's appropriately discussed in the right areas and environment, perhaps not in the public corridor or in the car park, but to make sure that it's not just swept under the carpet. And training should not just cover, you know, issues around puberty, adolescence and development, albeit that they are very important, but it's how you communicate with different family members, the young person themselves, your colleagues, your managers, about important areas of sexuality. And some of the topics that might arise are intimate care, something that you're involved in round the clock in your organisations. You might be changing a catheter, or helping manage incontinence, or just bathing and making sure someone is feeling cleansed and comfortable, and suddenly, if in the case of a man, he might have an erection or not. And we've touched on the other points that I've already mentioned around how you address some of the more complex issues of actually people coming in to visit maybe a girl or boyfriend in the hospice setting. So essentially, and finally in the training section, young people are individuals. Young people should be able to, wherever possible, appreciate their emerging sexuality. They must be respected for their personal interests and past experiences. And within the boundaries of the law, sex should be fun. It shouldn't be seen as a deterrent. The word sex in itself, as we've said many times in this presentation, has for too long been a taboo subject, and we have to get over that hurdle. But recognising at the same time it needs important considerations around the social, physical, emotional, psychological development of an individual. So just moving on, and I don't think we've got Claire yet, so I'm just going to just touch on the policies and a little bit of the legal framework, and then we'll have a couple of case histories. And after introducing those, I think it would be useful to discuss the case histories in the context of a discussion. I've said several times, clear, robust sexual policies are really important in the workplace. Why? Number one, I think it overcomes that big hurdle, the taboos about the three-letter word of sex. We have a national guidance, as already mentioned, produced by Together the Short Lives and the Open University, which you haven't already got in place. You can use as a thumbprint to help develop your own training policies. But every organisation should have a sexual policy. And if you have that, hopefully with good training, good support, clear reporting lines, a good understanding of not the whole legislation, but the key parameters within the legal framework, will improve confidence, not only for you as a practitioner, but the trust, the implicit trust that young people and families uphold in you, in your everyday work, and actually enable them to talk to you about important things in their life apart from their specific life-limiting or life-threatening condition. I think having an identified person or a lead, a sexuality lead, using the model of rainbows is a good one to follow, so that you almost, rather like the principles of the safeguarding lead in organisations, you have a named person whom you can refer to, who will lead this area, probably be mandated with producing the policy in consultation with the board or the organisation. But that individual can support the staff members and everyone. Big job, but a really important one, and that's why I think Rainbows has more than one. Just some of the underpinning principles, not just in relation to designing your own policy or looking at the sort of national standards and guidance, but recognising those human rights. Remember, I talked about the Human Rights Act 1998. There is also the Care Act 2014. And those underpinning principles that adhere and are relevant to the legislation, but respect the individual rights of young people. their privacy to information, increasingly important today, their dignity, their respect for their bodies, and their bodies in relation to them being human individuals with usually sexual needs and desires, and the importance of confidentiality, not gossiping or talking in the corridors or in the car park about someone's sexuality, which I know you don't do. To be treated in an age-appropriate way, I think sometimes that is quite a tricky one, in the sense that, as research is finding, that as young people are living longer, sometimes their awareness or desire for sexuality may come at a later stage. And I mentioned earlier on the importance of lifelong learning. Of course, not ignoring addressing puberty, relationships, sex education in early teens or maybe even before, but it is appropriate to the needs of those individuals. And I think one of the challenges is finding an information that is relevant to a person with Duchenne muscular dystrophy or cystic fibrosis, and actually how that hinges and relates to their individual sexuality. This may not be tailor-made information, and those principals need to recognise that without shame. Claire, had she been here in her presentation, would have cited some legislation which actually acknowledges that young people need to be protected, but I love the term she uses, bubble wrapped. Every time I wrap a parcel, I think of her these days. So not overprotecting people, allowing people within the boundaries of the law to make informed and wise decisions, but not being overprotected. And I know that's one of the challenges and difficulties for people. So we've already addressed the right to discuss and receive information about sex, if desired, and that being available for lifelong learning, for you, for the family members too, and being able to talk about sexuality and sex in a non-judgmental way. And just before a couple of the questions or case histories, we're very lucky through Together for Short Lives, Young Avengers Group, and the Open University Sexuality Alliance that have the input of outstanding individuals like Lucy Watt, some of you I'm sure have met, and Junior Hamad Jimmo, who are very active and committed members to the work we do, and have informed the directions. And they tell us regularly what young people want, how they need to have their sexuality acknowledged, regardless of the significance of their life-limiting or life-threatening condition. And that needs to be ongoing and accessible in a form that they will understand. I'm sure all of you have seen there, again, Junior, and all the pictures I've shown you today, we do have prior permission for their release on this presentation. So, the case histories. If you've got your document with you, the guidance and standards, or to a screen, by all means look at it. But if not, you should be able to see what we're going to have a brief discussion about now, because I'm conscious it's 10 past 1 rather. And the first one, Claire and I thought would be good to address, and we thought you might have read it and have been able to give it some consideration. So you have a man in his late teens, so let's for argument's say he's 17, but there is some ambiguity in late teens. He's having a short break in a young adult hospice, so places like Rainbows that provide such services. And he wants to masturbate, but he's got severe muscular degeneration and weaknesses in his upper part of his body and is unable to use his hands. So he cannot masturbate himself. He has regular erections. His life-limiting condition hasn't actually suppressed those. And he feels very sexually frustrated and he wants to relieve himself. Now, the reason we address this case history is probably with the most common discussion points and probably areas of concern that care practitioners have in the workplace. So what we're having here, just 3 or 4 points to consider. Number one, how do you manage that request as a care practitioner? If you haven't, or you're concerned about how you manage it, who would you actually talk to as an individual in a team meeting or with other staff members? And what other recourse could you make in its place? And I'm now going to turn to Guy and Lizzie, because it probably makes sense here to turn on the speakers and have a bit of a discussion around this, as I see it's already nearly 1:15.
Hi, yes, I think if people wanted to sort of make comments about this case study, then I think we've unmuted people. So I think it might be a bit messy. So if anybody wanted to make a comment on this case history, go ahead.
And could I specifically ask, if you do ask a question, if you don't mind saying what your role is, you might not want to say your name, that's fine, but actually just what your role is, because it puts it in context, and if you want to say where you work, that's fine. If you don't, equally fine. So over to you. If there's a silence, I'll give you tips. Any questions? Whilst we're waiting, and I'm not going to labour this, but of course there are issues in relation to touch and what you can do. And had Claire been here, but I know that she's given permission to share her slides, she would have talked about the Sexual Offences Act and issues of touching and what you can and you cannot do as a care practitioner. And of course, you know, restrictions need strong reasons, but it's important that you don't break the law. So just I touch upon just some of the key points of the Sexual Offences Act. I'm not going to bring up Claire's, I've got a separate presentation aside, but I think Lizzie and Guy will share it afterwards. What you have to weigh up is this person an adult? And we've said late teens, so arguably the person might be over 18. Is the person a non-carer? Are they able to communicate? Do they have capacity? Are they in privacy? And have they given consent? Now, if any of those are missing, you are at risk of a possible crime. So none of the measures in the Sexual Offences Act, and this I'm talking about the 2003 provisions, are intended to interfere with a full or the right to a full and active life, including a sexual life of people with learning disabilities or who have the capacity to consent. But I strongly, urge you to be really cautious about what you do, obviously, in the workplace that's not supported by the national guidance, your local policies, and in terms of the provisions. So I think the mantra, and it's written into the second edition, is, what features are missing and where you're at risk of a possible crime. And you have to look whether you're talking about children, the caring responsibilities, communication, consent, capacity, and privacy. Yes.
Lizzie here. I was just thinking with this particular case about, I guess, the kind of more practical side of what you would do in this situation. I presume you've spoken to quite a number of care professionals who had this happen to them.
Yes.
What kind of things have they done to relieve the young man's embarrassment about the whole situation? Really?
Absolutely. First of all, when they've been in doubt, they have discussed it. And actually, the first time it was raised with me was about 2 or 3 years ago at a conference. And actually, I won't say where the organisation was, but one organisation, they sought advice from the lawyer on their board, and actually what they actually did was, without touching, the important thing within the law and the practicalities is not actually physically touching the genitals, particularly in a non-sexual relationship. And actually that person was advised to put a towel round the young man's penis, and she gave him the young man a bell that he could press, and she left the room, and he had enough sensation. I mentioned this case history, that he could not, that he had no movements in the upper limbs, but in this case that individual could do that. That care practitioner left the room and returned to the room later. The man was able to masturbate, had an emission, and with dignity and compassion, she was then able to make him comfortable by cleaning up the bed, whatever. Yeah. And that's actually seemed quite a good practical solution. And I am aware, some of you may challenge me, that happens in other organisations. But it's the issue of touch. Of course, there's the possibility of sexual age, and with digital technology, and we can, let you have access to a website where, there are sexual aids where you've got minimal movement, which may help the individual get sexual release and masturbate. But I cannot stress enough the importance of making sure whatever is done is acknowledged within the governance and formal guidance of your organisation. And it goes back again to the training and information as well.
Yeah. Somebody, Sophie Williams has asked a question on the chat facility. I don't know whether you can see it there, Maddie.
No, I can't.
But she's just said that parents also have a difficulty discussing these subjects with their young person.
Yes.
It's not something young people actually talk about with their parents very much.
Well,
any reflections on that?
Yes. Some of you will be aware, I've done some recent research, and actually you will see it at some stage relatively soon. It was a question that came up quite a bit with parents, not just through that, but again, other sessions I've taught. And actually some parents really, really felt very uncomfortable. Others felt more comfortable, and I have to say it was people where they've worked in a health and social care setting and recognised the importance of the sexual relief. I'm not saying that all parents don't, but they had more realistic solutions. One of the real anxieties was based around gender. So, for example, a father who might, using the same principle I just described for the care practitioner, put his son, a daughter, something near her daughter to help her sexually relieve herself, or a mother perhaps doing, as described in the case history, wrapping the penis in a towel and leaving the room to allow the person to masturbate and have sexual emissions. There were some gender issues that parents were really anxious about in terms of, their risk of being accused of sexual abuse. And actually, in 2 or 3 cases, they discussed it proactively with their care team, their supporters in hospital, or indeed with a social worker to minimise that risk. So I have to say, fundamentally, most parents do recognise the older their young son or daughter gets, the more challenging those issues are, and that they can't ignore it, but actually find it difficult to manage. So I've given you an example of one way one couple, two parents managed it.
Do you have another case study, Maddie?
Yes, I was about to say it's 20 past 1.
Yeah, yeah.
And we'll move on. Whoops, I don't want to end the show. Right. Oops. Hope it's not frozen. Can you all see that? Yes. Are we unmuted again? Or you might as well leave it on, actually. So the fifth case history is one of 5 here, and we have plenty more. Is one of your colleagues, so a care practitioner, goes into the bedroom of a young adult, thinking the room was empty, but finds a young male adult having oral sex with another young male resident. Can I just say this was not in a hospice setting. It was actually in another type of residential unit. Both men in this case had a learning disability. The staff were concerned because they felt it did fall into the safeguarding procedures, and their reaction, and bear in mind all these case histories are real but are anonymised, they're not made up. They have all taken place and raised particular questions. So these 2 men were separated, put in separate units, and the whole issue about capacity to consent was raised. And yet these 2 men spent a lot of time together. They obviously enjoyed their company. They were good friends. They socialised a lot, as well as wanting sexual gratification. And they wanted to spend time together, and what they felt was a warm and friendly atmosphere. But of course, I recognise, and all of you will, that it presents some challenges. So the questions I raise here are legal. The colleague's reaction due to their own personal moral beliefs. And I think that was probably really difficult for that individual, because putting it back in a reality focus, the colleague realised, gosh, this person needs to, some fulfilment, but we are on a premises where we're supporting other individuals, albeit that these young men were technically young adults, but they had learning difficulties and they were in a room away from others. So there are issues of conflicts, trying to establish whether either or one or both of the individual men could have given their consent, and how they need support to understand the need for consent. This is not an easy issue at all. And what is the legal position? So before I touch on the law, maybe we can open it up to any questions, if there are any from the room, or the chat line, and Lizzie can read back the chat question, which is not visible here.
So we've got a question come through from Sarah, just asking whether you think people are starting to feel more comfortable talking about these issues in hospice settings, or is it still a long road to travel?
I think it's been a long road to travel, and whether it's getting easier, I think people are much more aware, and it's probably an area where social media and the media have been helpful. We have television channels, I'm not giving any names, but who actually do have regular programs about sexual rights of disabled people. So translating that to the hospice setting.
I'll ring them back in 5 minutes.
Sorry? Oh, sorry. That's not a question, no? Another one? Sorry, Sarah. I think hospices, particularly the young adult hospices, if I may say humbly, I think because when we published the guidance and standards, we made sure every hospice, young adult hospice, and many adult hospices, and Hospice UK and Marie Curie and National Council for Disabled Children, they all had access to this tool with the case histories. I think it's gradual. I'd like to think it had gone further. But I think people are becoming more confident and actually are aware of their responsibilities, that it's not something that can be brushed under the carpet for any longer.
Thanks, Maddie.
Any other questions before summing up? Do you want me just to sort of brief you on the law?
We have just 5 minutes, and I need a minute or two just to sum up at the end.
Okay, 1 minute. I think just the vital thing on this case history is that and I'm not going to give you a load of legalese, and bear in mind that the consultations in answering these case histories, we had a panel of 5 lawyers working with us. So if you feel this is a difficult subject, having 5 lawyers sharing some answers with us made us realise we want to get it right for everybody. So it's the legislation, going back to Sexual Offences 2003 provisions, is we have to work out what we mean by causing and inciting. So going back to the 2 men in a room having oral sex together, by not placing the 2 adult clients in 2 separate rooms, in terms of the criminal law, so the Sexual Offences Act 2003, the care worker is not causing or inciting sexual activity, and there's a legal provision for that. Unless the care worker themselves was actively encouraging the sexual behaviour, which clearly they weren't in this case, they would not individually be committing an offence. And actually what they were doing is probably following their own duty of care and local policies and procedures to ensure the safety and well-being. There is, however, a possibility of the practitioner or organisation, maybe being challenged for such behaviour. But obviously, probably in this instance, the practitioner made the right decision. I would suggest they didn't know at the time what was happening in the room. They might be challenged had they known that this event was going to take place and didn't act upon it accordingly in the way that they did. I think the issues of consensual activity go back to the Mental Capacity Act 2005 provisions again, which sort of explore how much individuals understand within that. And Claire has a lot of slides, which I haven't time to go through today, but I'm sure we can get permission to be shared with you, that look at the sort of ramifications and individual features of when a person with a learning disability may or may not be in a position to give consent. I think I'm going to draw a line there because it gives you 3 minutes, Lizzie.
Thanks, Maddie. Just wanted to say a huge thank you to Maddie for womanfully plodding through the whole presentation by herself. So I think that's it for now. We will say goodbye. A final thank you to Maddie. And goodbye.